we are going to look at Chapter 5, Section 2 of U.S. government, the Vice President and the First Lady. And first, we'll just look at the early Vice President. Now, the Constitution is going to give two formal duties. The first, presiding over the Senate, and second, presidential disability, or at least deciding on presidential disability. Now, the Constitution is going to look at the vice president and basically make them a president in waiting, and basically just playing the waiting game. So beyond those duties that were mentioned, it's just a president in waiting, but access wasn't so much granted to the vice president. Now, despite that they were only a heartbeat from the office, they were just treated as one of little real consequence throughout much of this nation's history. We get the idea that even though they are one step away, they were not as in high regard as they are today in attending of meetings and everything else. And so there was a lot of misinformation between the two, and the vice president wasn't really up to date on certain issues or operations militarily that they were really privy to, and so they were kind of in the dark with all of that. But now they're basically used to balance the ticket. A lot of presidential candidates will now look at people that they were running against in their own party and see that how they can balance the ticket, whether they are female or geographic location or race or any other of these indicators that play in to make them a more electable candidate and try to bring in more voters from one way or another. So just trying to balance the ticket just with a vice president by the virtue of ideological, geographic, racial, ethnic, gender, or any other characteristics. So basically being a president in succession, even though sometimes it doesn't always work out that way. But the point is to make yourself more electable, and so they will kind of give that to the presidential candidate. All right, now let's look at the transformation that we'll see from this no information post to now being a lot more available in meetings and being a little bit more in the know as far as information and military and everything else that goes on in the office of the president. So once we get to the Cold War in the late 1940s and the proliferation of nuclear weapons, we're going to see concerns that will grow out of the vice president's readiness to actually take helm at the moment's notice for the presidency and be aware of the issues of the world and the military developments that have been going on. And we see this the most with Harry Truman, who will become president after Franklin Roosevelt's sudden death in April of 1945. But he'd been kept in the dark about the American project to try to build the atomic bomb, which would be the Manhattan Project. But he was also not fully apprised of the rapidly mounting tension between the USSR, the Soviet Union, and the United States. So as World War II is going to draw to a close, we'll see that with President Roosevelt's death, Harry Truman will be forced to step into the presidency with little preparation for handling any of the issues that we just brought up in confronting the nation at that time. But by the 1950s, we see a new age of nuclear missiles, and many Americans will believe that such a situation should never be allowed again. So we have Dwight Eisenhower. We'll talk about how when he was the president for Nixon, even though if they were not good friends, he would still have him in every important conference of government, so that if death was to come upon him, there wouldn't be any interruption in the office. And this starts to begin the move toward bringing the vice president into the inner circle of the administration, but also as a result in a shift of the job of the vice president that will change. By the 1990s, we have Al Gore being the vice president under Bill Clinton, and he was given several important responsibilities, including studying the federal government to pinpoint wasteful areas. And Vice President Gore also had full access to the president in weekly one-on-one lunch meetings. Dick Cheney, who will serve with George W. Bush from 2001 to 2009, will also play a central role in the White House, and even some historians will suggest he might have been one of the most influential vice presidents that we've ever had. Now, let's move to filling a vice presidential vacancy. We see it being vacant 18 times, 9 times by secession, 7 by death, and 2 resignations. From that, what we'll have is the 25th Amendment of the Constitution that will deal with this matter of the vice presidential vacancies. And the amendment provides in part Whenever there is a vacancy in the office of the vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both houses of Congress. So this provision was first implemented in 1973, and in that year, President Richard Nixon will select and Congress will confirm Gerald R. Ford to succeed Spiro Agnew as vice president, and it will come into play again in 1974 when President Nixon will resign, and then President Ford will be named, and Congress will approve Nelson Rockefeller for his post. Now, let's look at the First Lady and the section Champions of Many Causes, and just kind of like the vice presidency, we will see their roles evolve as time goes on. During the early part of our nation's history, we see first ladies being pretty much limited to their work to informal behind-the-scenes advice, but also social functions. Abigail Adams is a prime example of this, basically serving as a trusted friend and confidant to her husband John throughout his long distinguished political career, including his term as president. As time goes on, though, we'll see first ladies that begin to take on a more public role. Edith Wilson, the wife of Woodrow Wilson, will speak on behalf of him and filter all communications after he was left partially paralyzed by a stroke in 1919. Jackie Kennedy will undertake an historic restoration of the White House and used her position to support the arts in general, hosting opera, ballet, Shakespeare, and other White House performances. President Nixon's First Lady, Pat Nixon, spent up to 5 hours a day responding to letters from voters, promoted a national volunteer program, and championed the cause of those with special needs. More recently, we saw First Lady Laura Bush help buttress support for military personnel and their families during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also promoting education reform. So we see the role becoming a little bit more to the forefront instead of kind of being in the back. As if you go back in earlier history, United States or world history, a lot of women are kind of resided to the fact of being more indoors in a advice role, or more of a talking point role, than being out more in the forefront and being more action oriented. And we see the role of the First Lady kind of come to the forefront of this as time goes on. We see Eleanor Roosevelt, where more First Ladies have become openly involved in political issues. And Mrs. Roosevelt, the wife of FDR, will travel extensively and speak on behalf of her husband and his policies, as well as her own concerns, and she will write a weekly newspaper column and will work tirelessly for Democratic candidates. And so we see the First Lady starting to roll into these champions of these causes and looking at building even some more support that we see. We see the First Lady Melania Trump that came out and was doing more of a bullying campaign and really advocating for children and bullying. And let's move to the last section and look at the evolving role of First Ladies. We have many First Ladies since Mrs. Roosevelt that will play an important role in the American society. We see Betty Ford was known for her support of equal rights for women. Barbara Bush launched a national effort to end literacy in the 1990s, but First Lady Hillary Clinton will spearhead the Clinton administration's efforts to overhaul the nation's healthcare system. First, we see First Lady Michelle Obama has been an outspoken advocate for programs and policies that support healthy eating and lifestyles. And obviously, as we look back at this, it's only going to be more involved as time goes on. And the real question that's left to this is, one, how far will it evolve? But also, two, what will we do with the first gentleman? What will that role be like? And with Hillary Clinton running on the Democratic ticket in 2016, we see that could have been the opportunity for the first. And I'm sure that there will be several other opportunities until we finally get to that point, and maybe we won't have a first gentleman. Who knows what will come in the future? But the interesting point will be, what will that role be fulfilled? Will it be the same as always? And obviously the Hillary Clinton dynamic is a little bit different because of President Clinton's role as being the president. But even coming from then, you can obviously insinuate that the roles will be somewhat similar, but how will the roles be taken on, or maybe even advanced from there on? And so this is kind of an open question that has been going around, especially with more and more women running for the presidency. And that's where we'll leave it off for Chapter 5, Section 2. See you soon.